Hi, I'm Anthony Bracatelli, and today will be my absolute delight to discuss the handwriting of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, a truly stunning couple that is rich in psychological complexity and great meaning. So today I will begin by examining, first of all, what does it really mean to be compatible? This is a difficult question because there are many levels of compatibility. There is physical compatibility, there is sexual compatibility, there is intellectual compatibility, there's emotional compatibility. So whenever you look at a writing, you have to look at the whole picture. You don't look at one individual sign, and you have to examine the overall image in order to contemplate the driving forces and to be able to put together a synthesis of the character and their relationship to each other. So I would just like to start by examining Meghan's writing. Now, Meghan, her writing is something which is highly calligraphic, and one of the things about calligraphy is that it's difficult to analyze because whenever you have a calligraphic writing, you know that the person is trying to adhere to a kind of model, and the personal writing movement, as Klages referred to it, is generally concealed behind the form. In other words, because the emphasis lies on the form, the unconscious impulses are less available for interpretation. Now, indeed, when you look at writing, you have to ask yourself, is this writing primarily governed more by movement, more by form, or more by space? And this actually bears a direct relationship to the Rorschach test and also to Müller-Enskat, the famous German graphologists who contemplated that they saw, in fact, the relevance of the relationship between graphology and the Rorschach in the sense that, you have a picture of form and you have a picture of movement and space. And when you look at characters, people will see different things depending on their personality, but that's the projective technique of graphology. And people have to understand that graphology is not astrology. It's not a hocus pocus. It's about dealing with fundamental differences in motor activity, whereby some people may, for instance, emphasize more the unconscious. Other people, the role of the eye, the so-called ocular schrift, as Erlenmeyer put it, a very well-known physiologist. This is going back over 100 years, but the work is still highly relevant today. And so, you have contemporaries of Freud and Jung still discussing the role of the eye versus the hand. What is the relationship? So now I would just like to get back to Meghan Markle's writing. And the famous graphologist Christian Detweiler said that when you look at a writing, there is what's known as the aesthetic light build. In other words, somebody who is very conscientious of their beauty, they're very conscientious of their appearance, and they're very perfectionistic. And there's a great need for control because the person doesn't want to slip up, they don't want to make a mistake. And sometimes when you look at a writing, it may look so perfect that it's hard to interpret. It's hard to really find the unconscious because to a great extent the unconscious lies at the level of movement rather than form. But when you look at this writing, again, the predominant emphasis is on ocular control. It's on the form, which is a static picture. Now, why does she have to emphasize the calligraphy? Well, there are many possible meanings of what calligraphy can mean. One of the possible meanings of calligraphy is that it's symbolic of a kind of persona. In other words, the person doesn't really want you to know who they are inside. They're very private. Again, that could relate in many instances to the public role of the person. Very important people oftentimes adopt persona writings. And this does not mean any dishonesty whatsoever. It merely implies that there is a division between the projection, how the image, how the person wishes to appear, and their own inner life, which is something that could potentially be radically divergent from the motoric side of expression. So when you look at her writing, what's quite interesting is that she actually has a great deal of narrowness. And she uses mostly arcades in the middle zone, and it's overconnected. So what this shows is that she does have some level of insecurity, but all in all, she is a real steamroller type of personality. She can be very demanding when she wants what she wants, and she's going to aggressively and relentlessly pursue her own aims. Now, these gestures in the upper zone are very interesting because, on the one hand, they look like rainbows. It's a gesture of optimism. It's a gesture of hope. But it's also a gesture of self-protection. In other words, she's very idealistic. She wants you to believe in this magical world, that she is aspiring to greatness. She is aspiring towards a kind of wonderful fantasy of sorts. Her daily life may not quite consummate to that dream. And when you look at Harry's writing, this is the fascinating thing, is that Harry's writing is so much more understated than Meghan's writing. His writing does not have any amount of real flair, in the sense of it's not flamboyant. It's actually a very reserved, very sober sort of withdrawn expression. He doesn't really, he's not going to express himself in the same emotional way that Meghan is so used to. He's much more of the introvert than she is, even though she's not an open person. In fact, her writing actually, I would say that she can behave in a very extroverted manner, but because of the closed nature of her writing, its overconnectedness and its narrowness, the middle zone in her writing actually contradicts the apparent expression of her being very outgoing and seemingly open. She's, again, being an extrovert is something which does not mean simply being outgoing. There are people who are very outgoing that are not open about their personal lives, and she has that need for privacy. And that's where you see it in that narrowness in the arcades, and she has some supported forms in her middle zone. But she actually has great poise, and she's very sensible because she knows what to say and how to appear and how to act. She's very conscientious. She's very perfectionistic. She's very dutiful. I believe she's a responsible person, but she's not going to really. You're not going to get to know her that easily because she really is very much. She's a little bit of a control freak, and that has to do. Freud talked about the anal period, and there's a lot of elements of compulsion, but when you look at his writing, he has a different character structure. One of the main differences is he has substantially wide distances between many of his words, and he also has these cradles in his lower zone. Now the cradles are interesting because I actually, in my own experience, I have found them with much greater prevalence among British writings and less so among American writings. And I think that one of the possible meanings of that is that the person doesn't quite, maybe they didn't have the connection. Early in childhood, there was something missing. I think there's a deep sense of nostalgic longing for the mother. And I think that when you look at his writing, you almost feel a kind of depressive longing, like there was a great loss in his life, and it was a severe blow to his ego. And he's a very sensitive, very refined man. He's a very, there's something, one of the most charming aspects of Prince Harry's writing is that he would be just as much comfortable wearing a t-shirt as a tuxedo. He doesn't have to have any need to show off, to say, I'm wonderful and I'm a prince. He has his intelligence inclines him to be more introspective. He's a very thoughtful man, and he needs that space. He needs to keep a cushion between himself and others for many reasons. One, he doesn't really trust other people a lot. He doesn't want people to take advantage of him. He's very selective as far as who he associates with. He feels like, to a great extent, people are going to be a waste of time because he really wants to focus on what's meaningful and valuable. And he's actually, there's certain, almost, when you look at the writing of scientists sometimes, like Louis Pasteur, and you look at the level of concentration that they had in their writings and their inward sort of curiosity with matters which may not have been, say, immediately relevant to everyday life. But in Harry's writing, he has to step back. He has to take a break because, unlike Meghan, who's more of she has more of an outgoing sort of nature, where she's going to, essentially what she's going to do is she's going to pull him out of his element. And he's not going to be completely comfortable dealing with that higher energy level. And but she's going to present herself in a much more ceremonial way. In other words, she's going to project more of an image of being sociable, and she's, in a sense, you could say, more presentable, and aesthetically she's more preoccupied with her self-image. Harry is not nearly as preoccupied with his physical image to the extent of Meghan's writing. Harry is more inward. Meghan, she could, be a very effective, like if she was to be a public relations person, she would have certain qualities, it's hard to describe, maybe certain social graces, where Harry would be more blunt, less forthcoming. He's not really going to let you know what he's thinking because that distance, and also if you notice how he has a very small eye which shrinks in his writing. And what that shows is that there are moments when he doesn't maybe have as much confidence as perhaps he should have, even though ultimately at the end of the day he's in control. The man has strong reins over his own life, and that slight left slant, and it's kind of like I'm going to control the reins of my emotions, and I'm not going to get all riled up inside. And I'm going to be critically observant and rational of my surroundings. And, the word endings are sort of curtailed. He doesn't really have much of a stroke at the end. But in her writing, it's just the opposite. You see, she has these prolonged upward finals. And one of the ways of interpreting that is it's a fanfare-like gesture, but it's kind of like calling attention to oneself, but then not quite wanting to open up because it forms a barrier to the right in Pulver's sense. It withdraws back to the left in a kind of centripetal gesture. It's a form of a canopy or an arcade. So she's going up into the upper zone, which also you could say symbolically, it's a kind of spiritual tendency, looking up towards answers, glorifying, say, the aristocratic ideal. But then at the end of the day, she has another side which is not, she's actually, because of the upper zone and all that stuff that she has up there, that represents her dreams and her fantasies. And the irony of when you look at these two writings is that from an objective point of view, you could say that Harry's writing is much less dreamlike. He's not living in the Walt Disney world. He's a much more sober in his reason, in the sense that he doesn't really, he doesn't have these vaulted sort of aspirations. He's just content with less, I guess, more simple. She actually has a much more opulent and luxurious, even like you could say this is a sybaritic kind of feeling to it because it's rich, it's very stylized, It's kind of again, it's a persona writing, which is not a bad thing. It just means that the person is very conscientious about appearing beautiful, and she is very charming. And but the whole thing is with his writing is that he doesn't have a persona. But one thing he does, which is quite interesting, is that if you look at his signature, again, I apologize, it's kind of dark because this is a photocopy, it's not an original. But when you look at the signature, he underlines it. And then he does not put his last name, he just underlines it and puts a period. And so what you have is an H, which is kind of exaggerated in size relative to the middle zone, but then he leaves a space, he doesn't immediately connect it. He goes down a little bit into the lower zone where he doesn't have to, but then he threads out the rest of the word. So there's a number of things that you can get from that. One is that when you see that H that's outsized and then with the gap, I see that as kind of that image of a lonely greatness. Inside, he is very aware of who he is. There's a sense of superiority. It's not arrogance, but he knows who he is. And then the fact that he omits the last name, to me, that suggests a number of things. First, he has to stand on his own 2 feet. He doesn't want to be confused with, to be swallowed up, say, by the image of his family. He knows he has great respect, great pride in his past, which is part of that use of the arcade and the left slant and the verticality and the poise and the formal control. But the omission of the last name and followed by the period says that I'm going to have it the way I want to. And I'm putting a period, it stops the movement, and it says I'm having the last word. And I'm going to live my life according to what I think. And, regardless of what my family thinks of me, I have to be my own person. And that resistance to that going back to the left is sort of like he's critically thinking about every aspect of his life. Sometimes it's difficult for him to move forward because he's always having doubts about, well, maybe if I do this, maybe if I do that. But he's going to, come to a decision. And so, there is maybe at times a certain element of aloofness. And he has his need for solitude and can be aristocratically reserved and have pride. It's not an arrogant writing. It's actually a very nice, modest writing. Good, very good intellectual qualities. He's a very fine mind, sensitive, but he doesn't really fully show maybe his sensitivity is, withheld because he has a sense of manneredness and appropriateness, but not persona. So when you look at the signature, he has that Y that goes down, and what that shows is that he has some dissatisfaction. He doesn't return to the baseline, but having to underline the signature is again a gesture of self-consciousness, wanting to stand on one's own feet and commit oneself. And it's you don't need it, but it's also putting a line beneath the id and saying, well, I don't want certain impulses entering into my consciousness, and I have to live according to reason, which the line symbolically, Immanuel Kant said that the line is symbolic of drawing limits. So whenever you draw a line, in a sense, it represents a boundary. Even Leibniz understood a line has a psychic quality to it. So when we look at these two writings, what do we sense as being, say, similar? Well, one of the main similarities is that they both have a strong need for privacy, and they have pride. She's going to be obviously much more outgoing and showy in a sense. She's more theatrical. She is a more hysterical kind of person. She's going to be much more emotional, even if she's not ultimately open. To a certain extent, it's a show. She's very, it's conscientious. His writing, he is more of what Jung would refer to as the introverted thinking type. She is more of the extroverted sensation type. That's one of the differences between their writings. Another thing I'd like to say is that part of the difficulty is that when you have somebody who's, say, more withdrawn and somebody who's very much more outgoing, you know, you should never think that two people have to be the same. That's actually wrong. You know, part of what makes people compatible is actually not looking for the same person. You know, Goethe had a famous saying. He said, "If I knew myself, I would run away." In other words, don't look for the person who precisely resembles yourself. Like, for instance, you know, maybe you're a very intellectual guy and maybe you're looking for a girl that's very athletic. Or maybe, you know, you're a girl that's athletic and you're looking for a guy that's kind of nerdy or whatever. But, you know, these are stereotypes. But the point is that there is never... We live in a world where there is infinite variations in human beings. And at the end of the day, you have to be very respectful of people. And, you know, when I look at writing, one of the things I've learned in the course of my life is that we all have our struggle. We all have our difficulties. We have to be very respectful and tolerant of other people. We all have things in our life that we can never quite put into words. And part of graphology, what graphology tries to do, is it tries to tap into that level of human expression which goes beyond, say, merely the lexical, the semantic level. It goes into the pictorial, the eidetic, the symbolic. So when you look at handwriting, you're trying to tap into the unconscious. And so today I would just like to thank you and say that it has been my utter delight to talk about this couple, and I really hope that they have, whatever happens, I think that it's a very interesting kind of compatibility, and I feel that nothing is perfect in this world, but it's a joy to find some connection, even where there's opposites, even where there's polarity. And Goethe understood that polarity comprises all of existence. You have light and you have dark, you have up and down, and all different. Everything is polar in life, but yet there is rhythm. Rhythm unites the whole entire fabric of our experience, and it brings a gestalt to life. So I thank you, and have a lovely night.